I mean it. This is your final warning. Don't you dare talk to my mother like that again, or else!
Rochelle Washington was crying, silent tears streaming down her face while a flight attendant stood over her, smiling. Her 13-year-old daughter, Kendra, sat frozen in seat 14B, trapped at 30,000 feet with a choice: stay quiet like everyone else on that plane, or stand up and risk everything. What Kendra didn't know was that her next words would get someone fired, go viral, and change airline policy forever. This is what happened when she issued her final warning. It started 2 hours earlier, the moment they boarded Flight 827 to Atlanta. Kendra Washington had sharp eyes and an even sharper sense of justice. At 13, she carried herself with a quiet confidence that came from watching her mother navigate a world that wasn't built for her. Rochelle, 42, with kind eyes and a gentle smile, had been deaf since birth. She'd raised Kendra alone after her husband died in a construction accident when Kendra was only 5. She'd taught her daughter sign language before she could speak, worked 2 jobs to keep them comfortable, and instilled in Kendra an unshakable belief that would define this day. Never be silent when you witness injustice. Today was supposed to be special. They were flying to Atlanta for Kendra's first national academic competition. She'd won the regional spelling bee and was representing her entire state. Rochelle had saved for 8 months to afford these tickets. She wore her Sunday best, a modest floral dress and her late husband's watch. Kendra wore the same denim jacket she'd owned for 3 years, patched at the elbows, but she wore it with pride. The cabin smelled like recycled air and expensive perfume. But all Kendra could smell was her mother's quiet excitement. As passengers settled into their seats, a flight attendant made her way down the aisle. Bridget Calloway was a woman in her late 30s with a severe bun, thin lips pressed into a permanent line of disapproval, and eyes that seemed to calculate a person's worth in seconds. Her uniform was immaculate, her posture rigid, her smile reserved only for certain passengers. When she reached row 14, that smile vanished completely. "Excuse me," Bridget said sharply, looking past Kendra directly at Rochelle. "You need to put your bag in the overhead compartment. Now." Her voice had that particular tone, the one that sounds professional on the surface but cuts like glass underneath. Rochelle didn't respond. She was looking at a photo on her phone. Kendra's father, smiling in his work clothes, lost in a memory of better days. "Ma'am, I'm speaking to you." Bridget's voice rose, louder this time, dripping with impatience that seemed to fill the narrow aisle. Kendra's stomach tightened. She recognized that tone, the assumption behind it. "My mother is deaf," she said clearly, signing simultaneously to her mother. "She didn't hear you." Bridget's eyes narrowed and something cold flickered across her face. "Well, she should have informed us before boarding. We have procedures for special passengers." The way she said special made Kendra's jaw clench. It wasn't a word meant to accommodate. It was a word meant to separate, to other. "She doesn't need special procedures," Kendra said, swallowing her anger. "I'll help her with anything she needs." "I'm not talking to you, little girl. I'm talking to your mother." Bridget bent down, speaking slowly and loudly, as if volume could somehow penetrate deafness. "Can you understand me?" Several passengers turned to watch. Kendra saw them, some with discomfort on their faces, others with something worse: indifference. Rochelle, sensing the commotion, looked up confused. Kendra quickly signed an explanation, her hands moving with practiced fluidity. Her mother's face fell slightly, taking on that familiar look of resignation she wore whenever the hearing world made her feel small. A look Kendra had seen too many times before. "It's okay, baby," Rochelle signed back, her movements gentle, defeated. "Just tell her we'll move the bag." But Kendra saw something else in her mother's eyes, a tiredness that had nothing to do with the early morning flight. A weariness that came from years of being treated like an inconvenience, like a problem to be managed rather than a person to be respected. And in that moment, something inside Kendra shifted. Her fingers tightened around her mother's hand, a silent promise forming in her mind. This flight was going to be different. 20 minutes later, when Kendra returned from the bathroom, she found her mother sitting rigid in her seat, tears silently streaming down her face. And Bridget Calloway was standing in the aisle, arms crossed, smiling. That smile would haunt Kendra for years, because it wasn't the smile of someone who'd made a mistake. It was the smile of someone who thought they'd won. "What happened?" Kendra demanded, sliding back into seat 14B. Her voice came out sharper than she intended, but she didn't care. Her mother's hands were trembling. Before Rochelle could sign a response, Bridget turned toward them, and Kendra realized with a sickening jolt that the flight attendant had been speaking to another passenger. Loud enough for nearby rows to hear. Loud enough to ensure maximum humiliation. "That's why they should sit in the back," Bridget was saying, her voice carrying that false concern people use when they want to sound reasonable while saying something cruel. "If you can't communicate properly, you shouldn't be taking up premium seats. There are protocols for passengers like that." They were in economy. Row 14 was nowhere near premium, but facts didn't seem to matter to Bridget Calloway. Kendra felt heat rush to her face. Around them, passengers shifted uncomfortably. An older woman in row 13 looked away quickly, suddenly fascinated by the safety card in her seat pocket. A businessman across the aisle buried himself deeper in his laptop. Two teenagers in row 15 exchanged glances, but said nothing. The silence of witnesses cut deeper than Bridget's words. "What happened?" Kendra repeated, this time directly to Bridget. The flight attendant's expression shifted into something that resembled patience, but her eyes remained cold. "Your mother tried to get up while the beverage cart was coming through. She nearly knocked over an entire tray. Perhaps if she could hear the announcements." "She didn't know." Kendra's voice rose before she could stop it. "Did you tell her? Did you tap her shoulder? Did you make any attempt to communicate with her before deciding to embarrass her in front of everyone?" "I don't have time to babysit every passenger with special needs." Bridget's smile turned cruel, a mask dropping to reveal something ugly underneath. "That's your job, apparently. Maybe next time fly an airline that caters to your situation." The words hit like a physical blow. Kendra looked around the cabin, searching for someone, anyone, who would acknowledge how wrong this was. She found some passengers looking uncomfortable, their faces tight with secondhand shame. Others deliberately avoided eye contact, choosing the safety of ignorance. And a few actually nodded along with Bridget, as if her mother's deafness was a personal inconvenience to them. As if Rochelle's existence in this space was somehow an imposition on their comfort. Kendra's hands were shaking now, but not from fear. From something else entirely. Something her father had taught her about before he died, back when she was small enough to sit on his lap while he explained the world's injustices. He'd called it righteous anger, the kind that demands action. "What's your name?" Kendra asked, her voice dropping to something quieter. More dangerous. Bridget blinked. "Excuse me?" "Your name. On your badge." Kendra leaned forward slightly, reading the small text. "Bridget Calloway. I want to remember it." Something flickered across the flight attendant's face. Uncertainty, maybe, or recognition that this child wasn't going to simply accept what was happening. But then her expression hardened, her professional mask snapping back into place with practiced ease. "You threatening me, little girl?" Bridget leaned in close, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow felt more menacing than if she'd shouted. "Because I can have you and your mother escorted off this plane the minute we land. I've been doing this job for 15 years. I know people, important people, and trust me, no one's going to believe a child over a senior flight attendant." Kendra felt her mother's hand find hers under the armrest, squeezing gently. A familiar gesture, a warning. When she looked over, Rochelle was signing with her free hand, her movements quick and desperate. "Don't," her mother signed. "Please, it's not worth it." But it was worth it. Kendra knew it in her bones. Her mother had taught her that fighting injustice was always worth it, even when, especially when, that lesson came at a cost. Rochelle had spent years telling her daughter to speak up, to stand tall, to never let the world make her small. And now when it mattered most, she was asking her to stay quiet. Not because it wasn't worth fighting, but because she'd been fighting the same battle her entire life, and she was tired. So tired of proving her humanity to people who'd already decided she was less than. Kendra looked at her mother's face, at the tears still wet on her cheeks, at the resignation settling into her features like an old familiar friend. Then she looked at Bridget, who was already turning away, confident in her victory. That confidence would be her downfall, because Kendra did something her mother didn't see. She pulled out her phone, opened a new note, and at the top, she typed 2 words in capital letters: evidence log. She had no idea yet what she'd do with it, no plan beyond documentation. But she was going to record everything, every word, every action, every pattern. Her father had taught her that injustice thrives in darkness, in the moments people think no one's paying attention. But Kendra was paying attention now, and she wasn't going to look away. For the next hour, Kendra watched. She watched everything. She watched Bridget glide through first class like she was serving royalty. A white couple in their 50s received her brightest smile, the kind that reached her eyes and transformed her entire face. She laughed at something the man said, leaning in conspiratorially as she poured champagne into crystal flutes. "Oh, Mr. Harrison, you're terrible," she said, her voice warm honey. She offered them extra snacks without being asked, adjusted the woman's reading light, brought a second pillow without prompting. An elderly white woman in row 6 received the same treatment. Bridget's voice turned honey-sweet as she helped arrange a blanket around the woman's shoulders, tucking it in with gentle care. "There you go, sweetheart. You just rest now. I'll check on you in a bit." The tenderness in her tone made Kendra's stomach turn. A young white businessman got the full performance too. Bridget chatted effortlessly about his connecting flight, offered him extra peanuts, made sure his drink was refilled before he even noticed it was empty. She treated him like a valued guest, someone worth her time and attention. Then Kendra watched the invisible line appear. The Rodriguez family sat in row 9, a father with 2 young children who looked exhausted from travel. When the father raised his hand politely and asked for water, Bridget's eyes slid past him as if he were furniture. She walked by once, twice, 3 times. Each time, his hand stayed raised. Each time, she found something more important to do. By the 4th pass, he'd lowered his hand, his shoulders sagging with a defeat that looked practiced, familiar. His children watched him with wide eyes, learning a lesson they were too young to understand, but old enough to absorb. An elderly black man in row 17 tried to stow his carry-on bag in the overhead compartment. Bridget appeared instantly, her voice sharp. "Sir, that bin is full. You'll need to check that bag." The man pointed to the obvious empty space beside another passenger's luggage. "But there's room, right?" Bridget cut him off. "Sir, I said it's full." "Gate check is back at the entrance." He made the long walk back, past rows of white passengers whose bags had somehow fit just fine. Kendra's phone screen glowed in the dim cabin as she typed. Row 17, elderly black man, forced to check bag despite visible space. Time, 10:47 a.m., 7 incidents, 7 pieces of evidence, 7 reasons to speak up. Mrs. Patel sat in row 11 with her daughter, a small girl who couldn't have been more than 7. The child raised her hand, urgent in the way children get when they need something important. Bridget walked past. The girl's hand stayed up, her mother gently encouraging her. Bridget made another pass, this time with the beverage cart, her eyes somehow never landing on the raised hand or the growing desperation on the mother's face. 10 full minutes passed before another flight attendant, a younger man with kind eyes, noticed and helped. Mrs. Patel's thank you came out in a rush of relief and embarrassment. Kendra documented it all. Times, seat numbers, specific actions. The pattern became undeniable with each entry. She noticed something else too. The way passengers of color made themselves smaller in their seats. The way they avoided eye contact with Bridget. The way they seemed to take up less space, breathe quieter, exist more carefully. They recognized what was happening because they'd lived it before. In grocery stores, at schools, in doctors' offices, on airplanes. The locations changed, but the experience remained constant. Her mother noticed her typing and signed a question, her hands moving with maternal concern. "What are you doing?" Kendra signed back with 1 word, her movements deliberate. "Preparing." Rochelle's eyes widened slightly, understanding and worry mixing in her expression. But she didn't tell Kendra to stop. Some part of her, the part that had endured a lifetime of these moments, wanted to see what her daughter would do with all this evidence. Whether the next generation might succeed where hers had simply survived. Kendra added another entry to her evidence log. Her list was growing, and so was her resolve. She didn't know exactly when she'd use this information, but she knew the moment was coming. She could feel it building like pressure before a storm. That's when Bridget made her fatal mistake. She stopped at row 14 again, clipboard in hand, her expression already set in disapproval. Your mother needs to keep her tray table up during beverage service. Kendra looked at her mother's tray table. It was already up. It had never been down. Rochelle hadn't touched it since they'd boarded. The lie hung in the air between them, so blatant it took Kendra's breath away. This wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding. This was manufactured conflict. Bridget was looking for reasons to target them, inventing problems that didn't exist. And in that moment, Kendra understood something that chilled her. This woman wasn't going to stop. She would keep pushing, keep finding fault, keep humiliating her mother until someone made her stop. Have you ever witnessed discrimination and struggled with whether to speak up? That question would haunt the passengers of Flight 827 for years to come. But right now, in this moment, only one person was ready to answer it. Kendra looked up at Bridget Calloway and said, her voice steady and clear, "It is up." Bridget's eyes flashed with something dark. "Don't correct me. I know what I saw." "You saw wrong," Kendra replied, keeping her voice level despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. The flight attendant's nostrils flared. She straightened to her full height, using every inch of her authority like a weapon. "That's it. I'm writing up a report. You're being disruptive. I'm sitting quietly in my seat. You're being disrespectful to crew, which is a federal offense." Bridget pulled out her phone, making a show of opening some kind of incident report app. "Keep it up, and I'll have the captain involved. You'll be met by security when we land. Is that what you want? To ruin your mother's trip because you can't control your mouth?" The threat landed exactly as intended. Around them, passengers who'd been pretending not to listen suddenly found their screens fascinating. The businessman in 14A shifted uncomfortably, but kept his eyes locked on his laptop. The woman behind them coughed and looked away. Nobody wanted to be associated with the disruptive passenger. Nobody wanted to risk being caught in whatever was about to happen. Kendra felt something crystallize inside her chest, a clarity that cut through the fear and uncertainty. She thought of her father, who died when she was 5, but whose voice still echoed in her mind during moments like this. He'd worked construction in a city that didn't value black labor. He'd faced foremen who questioned his qualifications, inspectors who scrutinized his work twice as hard, colleagues who assumed he'd cut corners, but he'd never backed down. Never made himself smaller to make others comfortable. "Baby girl," he'd told her once, kneeling down so they were eye to eye, "the world's going to try to tell you that you don't belong in certain spaces, that you're too much or not enough, that speaking up makes you difficult. But here's what I need you to know. Your voice matters, your mama's dignity matters, and sometimes the hardest thing and the right thing are the same thing." She thought of her mother, who'd built a life in a world designed for people who could hear, who'd learned to read lips in 3 languages, who'd worked 2 jobs to send Kendra to a good school, who'd taught her daughter that strength wasn't about never being hurt, it was about refusing to let that hurt define you. Rochelle had spent decades navigating spaces that treated her deafness like a deficiency instead of a difference. And she'd done it with grace Kendra was only beginning to understand. Every lesson, every story, every moment of her 13 years had prepared her for exactly this. The question wasn't whether she could stay silent. It was whether she could live with herself if she did. Kendra reached down and unbuckled her seatbelt. The click echoed in the tense cabin. Beside her, Rochelle's hand shot out, grabbing her arm. Her mother's eyes were wide, pleading, "Don't do this. Don't make yourself a target. Don't risk what I've spent your whole life trying to protect you from." But Kendra gently removed her mother's hand and stood up. At her full height, she was small, just a 13-year-old girl in a patched denim jacket, standing in the narrow aisle of an airplane. Bridget towered over her, shadow falling across Kendra's face like a threat. Other passengers turned now, unable to maintain their careful ignorance. Conversation stopped. Screens paused. The cabin held its breath. Kendra's presence filled the space in a way that had nothing to do with physical size. She stood with her back straight, her chin up, her hands steady at her sides. She looked exactly like her father had looked when he'd faced down a contractor who tried to shortchange him. exactly like her mother looked every time she walked into a room full of hearing people and demanded to be seen as equal. Bridget's lips curled into a smirk. She thought she'd won. She thought this child would crumble under the weight of authority and consequence. She thought Kendra would back down like everyone else had, like the Rodriguez father who'd lowered his hand, like Mr. Okafor who'd checked his bag without further protest, like Mrs. Patel who'd waited in silent desperation. She thought fear would do what cruelty couldn't. She had no idea what was about to happen. The thing about underestimating people is that it gives them power you don't see coming. Bridget had spent 2 hours making assumptions about who belonged and who didn't, who deserved respect and who could be dismissed. She'd gotten comfortable in her prejudice, confident that no one would challenge her. That comfort was about to cost her everything. Kendra looked up at Bridget Calloway, and when she spoke, her voice didn't waver. It didn't shake. It carried through the cabin like a bell, clear and unmistakable, reaching every passenger who'd spent the last 2 hours pretending not to see. This is your final warning. The cabin seemed to hold its breath. 200 passengers suspended in a moment that felt stretched and fragile, like glass about to shatter. Bridget laughed, a sharp, ugly sound that cut through the silence. Did you just threaten me? A child? I gave you a warning, Kendra said. That's different. Sit down right now or I'm calling the captain. Bridget reached for the call button near the galley, her hand hovering over it like a weapon she was eager to deploy. Call him, Kendra said. I'd like to speak with him anyway. Several passengers were definitely watching now. The businessman in 14A had abandoned all pretense of working. The teenagers in row 15 had their phones out. An older couple 3 rows back leaned into the aisle for a better view. Kendra could feel their attention like heat on her skin. But she didn't break eye contact with Bridget. Behind her, Rochelle was signing frantically, her hands moving with desperate speed. Kendra, please sit down. Don't make trouble. We can just get through this. Please, baby, please. But Kendra couldn't sit down, not anymore, because sitting down meant accepting what had happened. It meant teaching her mother that silence was safer than justice. It meant becoming another passenger who looked away, who told themselves it wasn't their problem, who chose comfort over courage. For the past hour and 23 minutes, Kendra said, her voice carrying to nearby rows with perfect clarity, you've treated my mother with disrespect. You've spoken to her loudly, as if she's stupid rather than deaf. You've implied she shouldn't be on this flight. You've made false accusations about her behavior, like just now, claiming her tray table was down when it wasn't. You've refused to make reasonable accommodations that would take seconds of your time. Your mother, Bridget started, but Kendra cut her off. I'm not finished. Her eyes blazed with something that made the flight attendant take a step back. And it's not just my mother, it's Mr. Okafor in 17C, who you forced to check his bag even though there was visible space. It's the Rodriguez family in row 9, who you ignored for 10 minutes when they asked for water. It's Mrs. Patel in 11A, whose 7-year-old daughter raised her hand for help, and you walked past her 4 times. At the mention of their names, the passengers Kendra had been documenting reacted. Mr. Okafor, the elderly black man from row 17, sat up straighter. Mr. Rodriguez turned in his seat. Mrs. Patel's hand went to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears at being acknowledged, at being seen. I've been watching you, Kendra continued, pulling out her phone and holding it up. I've been taking notes, times, seat numbers, specific incidents. And I've noticed that your rudeness, your impatience, your I don't have time attitude only appears with certain passengers. Can you guess what they have in common? Bridget's face had gone very pale, then flushed red. How dare you? I'm 13 years old, Kendra said, her voice stronger now, filling every corner of that cabin with truth that had been waiting to be spoken. And even I can see what you're doing, which means you definitely know what you're doing. You just thought no one would call you out on it. You thought we'd all stay quiet like we're supposed to, like good passengers who don't make scenes or file complaints or demand basic human decency. The flight attendant's hands were shaking now. She looked around the cabin, searching for allies, for someone to validate her, to tell this child she was out of line. But she found only faces staring back at her with varying degrees of discomfort, recognition, and dawning horror. "Sit down right now." Bridget's voice cracked on the last word. "This is my final warning," Kendra repeated, and this time the words landed with the weight of a verdict. "Apologize to my mother. Treat her with the basic human dignity you've shown to other passengers. And stop discriminating against people who don't look like you. Because if you don't, if you keep doing this, I will make sure everyone knows. I'll file a formal complaint. I'll post about this online. I'll tell every news outlet that will listen about Bridget Calloway, the racist flight attendant on Flight 827. This is your chance to do the right thing." The silence that followed was so complete, passengers could hear the engine hum 30,000 feet below them. Kendra's heart hammered in her chest, but she kept her face calm. Bridget's mouth opened, closed, opened again like a fish gasping for air. Her professional mask had shattered completely, leaving only raw panic and rage. And then, from 3 rows back, a voice shattered the silence like a hammer through ice. "She's right." Everyone turned. An elderly black man in row 17 stood up, his posture military straight, his voice dignified and powerful enough to fill the entire cabin. "I've flown 2 million miles in my career as a federal judge," Mr. Okafor said, letting those words sink in. "And I know discrimination when I see it." Bridget's face went from red to ash gray. A federal judge. She'd targeted a federal judge. Mr. Okafor's words hung in the air like a gavel strike. "She's been treating us like criminals, like we don't belong here. And I've sat in silence for 2 hours watching it happen, which makes me complicit. But this young lady has more courage in her little finger than I've shown this entire flight." Bridget opened her mouth, but before she could form words, another voice joined. "My daughter raised her hand for 15 minutes. Mrs. Patel stood in row 11, her voice shaking but determined. "She's 7 years old and needed the bathroom. This woman walked past us 4 times without stopping. 4 times she looked right at us and kept walking. She told us there was no more water," Mr. Rodriguez added from row 9, rising to his feet. His children watched with wide eyes as their father found his voice. "But I watched her give 3 bottles to the gentleman in 3A. When I asked again, she said I'd have to wait for the next service. It was like watching a dam break. One voice gave permission for another, and another, until the truth poured out in a flood that couldn't be contained." A young South Asian man in row 8 stood. "She questioned my boarding pass twice, asked if I was sure I was in the right seat. The passenger before me, who was white, wasn't asked anything." An older black woman near the back called out, "She told me the bathroom was occupied when it wasn't. Made me wait 10 minutes until a white passenger went in immediately after." The witnesses kept coming, each story another nail in the coffin of Bridget's defense. The flight attendant tried to speak, to explain, to deflect, but every time she opened her mouth, another passenger cut her off with their experience, their evidence, their truth. Bridget's defenses crumbled in real time. Her face cycled through emotions: shock, anger, fear, desperation. She looked around for support, for someone to say these passengers were exaggerating, being too sensitive, playing some kind of card. But she found only condemnation in the eyes staring back at her. Then something unexpected happened. A man from first class stood up. He was white, middle-aged, with silver hair and an expensive suit that screamed corporate power. He carried himself with the easy confidence of someone used to being the most important person in any room. Kendra's stomach dropped. Here it comes, she thought. Here comes the person who'll defend Bridget, who'll tell everyone they're overreacting, who'll use his authority to shut this whole thing down. The man walked down the aisle with measured steps. Passengers parted instinctively, responding to the air of command he carried like a second skin. He stopped directly in front of Bridget, who looked at him with desperate hope. Finally, an ally. "I'm Marcus Fleming," he said, his voice carrying easily through the cabin. "CEO of Transglobal Airlines." The cabin went deadly silent. Even Kendra felt her breath catch. The CEO. The actual CEO was on this flight. Bridget's desperate hope transformed into abject terror in the space of a heartbeat. Marcus held up his phone, the screen still glowing. I've been recording this entire interaction since the young lady stood up. I fly my own airline incognito twice a month to monitor service quality, to see how my employees treat passengers when they think nobody's watching. He turned the phone so Bridget could see the recording playing back her own words, her own actions, captured in damning clarity. This is unacceptable. Those three words fell like an executioner's blade. Marcus's voice held no anger, no emotion at all, just cold, corporate finality. You're fired, effective immediately. When we land, security will escort you off the plane. You'll receive formal termination papers within 48 hours. But let me be clear. Your employment with Transglobal Airlines ended the moment you made that comment about passengers sitting in the back. Bridget's mouth opened and closed silently. Her hands clutched at her uniform as if trying to hold on to the identity she'd worn for 15 years. But I didn't. You can't. I can, and I just did. Marcus's expression remained neutral, professional, devastating in its lack of sympathy. You violated our anti-discrimination policy at least 7 times in the past 2 hours. You created a hostile environment for passengers. You brought shame to this company and everyone who works here with integrity. The silence stretched. Passengers barely dared to breathe. This was justice unfolding in real time, swift and inescapable. Then Bridget's eyes landed on Kendra with pure, undiluted hatred. The mask was gone completely now, revealing the ugliness that had been lurking underneath all along. "This is your fault," she hissed, her voice venomous. "You ruined my life. You arrogant little—" "No." Kendra's voice cut through the venom quietly but clearly. "You did that yourself. I just refuse to let you ruin ours." The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, oblivious to the reckoning that had just unfolded in his cabin. "Folks, we'll be landing in about 30 minutes. Please return to your seats and prepare for arrival." Kendra sat down, her legs suddenly shaky now that the adrenaline was fading. Immediately, Rochelle pulled her into a crushing embrace. Her mother was crying, but these tears were different from the ones Bridget had caused. These were tears of pride, of relief, of something fierce and protective that only a mother could feel watching her child fight battles she'd spent a lifetime losing. Rochelle pulled back and signed with trembling hands, her movements almost frantic. "You were so brave, so brave. Your father would be so proud." But Kendra didn't feel brave. She felt exhausted, shaky, overwhelmed by what she'd just done and what it might mean. Her hands were still trembling, her heart still raced, and somewhere beneath the surface of everything, she felt angry. Angry that she'd had to be brave at all. Angry that a 13-year-old girl had to teach grown adults about basic human decency. Angry that this was just Tuesday for so many people. The plane descended through clouds toward Atlanta. Around them, the cabin slowly came back to life, but the atmosphere had fundamentally shifted. Bridget had disappeared into the galley, likely under orders from Marcus Fleming to stay out of sight until landing. Another flight attendant, a younger woman who looked mortified by what her colleague had done, took over the final service checks with apologetic efficiency. When the wheels touched tarmac, unexpected applause broke out. It started somewhere in the middle of the cabin and rippled forward and back, passengers clapping not for the landing, but for something else entirely. For justice, for courage, for a child who'd done what they hadn't. As passengers began to disembark, dozens stopped at row 14. An older white woman pressed a tissue into Kendra's hand with tears in her eyes. "Thank you for saying what needed to be said." The businessman from 14A, who'd stayed silent throughout everything, shook Kendra's hand awkwardly. "I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner. That was cowardice on my part." Marcus Fleming appeared as they gathered their belongings. He handed Kendra a business card, heavy stock with raised lettering. "You ever need anything, you call me directly. That's my personal cell on the back. And your mother flies free on Transglobal for life. Both of you. It's the least I can do." Mrs. Patel's daughter ran up with a piece of paper folded in half. When Kendra opened it, she found a crayon drawing of a girl with a cape, standing on top of an airplane. The words "Super Kendra" were written across the top in careful 7-year-old handwriting. The girl beamed up at her. "That's you. You're a superhero." Mr. Okafor approached last, his bearing dignified even in this informal moment. He shook Kendra's hand with both of his own. The world needs more young people like you. People who see wrong and refuse to accept it as normal. He glanced at Rochelle. You've raised a remarkable daughter, ma'am. Truly remarkable. But as they walked through the terminal, bags in hand, Kendra noticed something that made her stomach sink. Bridget was being escorted by two security officers toward a side exit. As they passed, Bridget caught Kendra's eye. The look she gave wasn't remorseful. It wasn't apologetic or reflective, or any of the things someone who'd learned a lesson might show. It was venomous, promising. A look that said, this isn't over. A look that said, you'll regret this. A look that said, I'll find a way to make you pay. Worse, Kendra noticed others in the crowd watching the scene. Not everyone's face showed support. Some people stared at Kendra with expressions that echoed Bridget's resentment. Their faces held anger that a child had spoken up, that she'd gotten someone fired, that she'd made such a scene. The look that said, how dare you? The look that said you should have stayed in your place. The look that said things were fine before you opened your mouth. Rochelle squeezed her hand, sensing her daughter's distress. She signed with one hand while pulling their luggage with the other. What's wrong? Kendra didn't know how to sign what she was feeling. That winning one battle didn't mean winning the war. That speaking up had consequences that extended beyond the immediate moment. That the hatred in Bridget's eyes wasn't unique. It was everywhere, woven into the fabric of daily life, just usually hidden better behind professional smiles and polite words. That being 13 and black and constantly having to prove her right to exist in spaces was a weight she shouldn't have to carry. But then she saw something that shifted her perspective. The Rodriguez family was waving at her with huge smiles, the children bouncing excitedly as their father nodded with deep respect. Mrs. Corey Patel and her daughter walked past with their heads high, no longer making themselves small, no longer apologizing for taking up space. Mr. Okafor was on his phone already, his voice carrying as he told someone about the remarkable young lady on my flight who reminded me what courage looks like. Small ripples, small changes, small victories that might grow into something bigger. 6 months later, an envelope arrived at the Washington household bearing the Trans-Global Airlines logo. Kendra had just come home from school, her backpack heavy with textbooks and the regional spelling bee trophy she'd won in Atlanta sitting proudly on the mantel. She'd placed third at nationals, but somehow that felt less important than what had happened on the flight there. Rochelle signed for Kendra to open it while she finished preparing dinner. The letter inside was printed on thick paper, official and formal. Kendra read it aloud while signing simultaneously, a habit she'd developed so her mother never felt excluded from anything. Dear Miss Washington, on behalf of Trans-Global Airlines, I'm writing to inform you of significant policy changes implemented as a direct result of your courage on Flight 827. The letter detailed mandatory anti-discrimination training for all employees, a passenger advocate hotline that connected directly to corporate oversight, and perhaps most surprisingly, the establishment of the Kendra Washington Award for young people who demonstrate moral courage in the face of injustice. Rochelle's eyes filled with tears as Kendra read, but she shook her head and signed rapidly. That's wonderful, but it's not the most important thing. She was right, because underneath the official Trans-Global letter was another envelope, this one handwritten. The return address simply said, Patricia Chen, Seat 8B, Flight 827. Kendra didn't remember anyone named Patricia. She carefully opened it and began to read. Dear Kendra, I watched everything that happened on that flight. I saw what that flight attendant did to you and your mother. I saw her treat other passengers with cruelty and contempt. I saw it all, and I was ashamed because I said nothing. The words hit harder than Kendra expected. She kept reading, her voice growing quieter. I told myself it wasn't my business. I told myself you were handling it. I told myself I didn't want to make things worse. I told myself a lot of lies because the truth was simpler and uglier. I was scared. Scared of making a scene. Scared of being wrong. Scared of what speaking up might cost me. Scared that if I stood up, I'd become a target too. So I sat in my seat and I watched a 13-year-old child do what I, a 46-year-old woman, was too cowardly to do. Kendra's hands started to shake. She'd spent 6 months thinking about the passengers who'd stood up, Mr. Okafor, Mrs. Patel, Mr. Rodriguez. She hadn't thought much about the ones who'd stayed silent, but Patricia had been thinking about it. Apparently, she hadn't stopped thinking about it. But watching you, a child who had more courage in your little finger than I had in my whole body, changed something in me. It planted a seed I couldn't ignore. Last week, I witnessed discrimination at my workplace. A colleague making comments about our new hire's accent, suggesting maybe she wasn't qualified, maybe her credentials from her home country weren't legitimate. And I felt that same instinct rise up. Stay quiet, it's not your business. Don't make waves. Kendra's throat tightened as she continued reading. But then I thought about you, about how you stood up when no one else would, about how your voice, your 13-year-old voice, had more power than all the adults who stayed silent. And I realized that silence isn't peace, it's permission. It's telling people like Bridget Calloway that what they're doing is acceptable, that no one will challenge them, that cruelty can hide behind professionalism and no one will call it what it is. The letter went on to describe how Patricia had reported the discrimination at her workplace, how she'd documented it the way Kendra had documented Bridget's behavior, how she'd stood up in a meeting and said this isn't acceptable, how uncomfortable it had been, how some colleagues had thanked her privately but wouldn't support her publicly, how her manager had initially been defensive, but also how the new hire had looked at her with tears in her eyes and said, "Thank you for seeing me. I made a difference because you showed me how," Patricia wrote. "Your courage created courage in me. And that's how change happens, not all at once, not in grand gestures, but in small moments when people decide they've had enough of looking away. You taught me that. A child taught me what I should have known my whole life." Kendra read the final lines through tears she didn't bother wiping away. "Thank you for being braver than the adults around you. Thank you for protecting your mother. Thank you for teaching me that silence isn't peace. It's permission. I'm trying to be more like you every day. With deepest gratitude and respect, Patricia Chen." Kendra folded the letter carefully and looked at her mother. Rochelle was crying openly now. But she was also smiling. She signed slowly, her movements gentle and deliberate. "Do you understand now? What you did on that plane wasn't just for us. It was for everyone who's ever been made to feel small. Everyone who's ever been treated as less than human. You gave them permission to stand up too." "But I was so scared," Kendra signed back, her own hands trembling with the memory. "Courage isn't the absence of fear," her mother signed, the same words she'd been teaching Kendra since she was small. "It's choosing to act despite it." That night, Kendra sat at her bedroom window looking at the stars scattered across the Atlanta sky. Planes blinked across the darkness, red and white lights moving through the vast emptiness like modern constellations. She wondered how many stories were happening inside those metal tubes right now. How many Bridgets were wielding their small powers cruelly? How many passengers were making themselves smaller, quieter, less troublesome? How many children were watching their parents be humiliated and learning that silence was survival? But she also wondered how many people were speaking up, how many Patricias were finding their voices, how many witnesses were becoming participants instead of spectators. A memory surfaced, sharp and clear despite the years. She'd been 7 years old, small enough to fit perfectly in her father's lap. He'd come home from work angry that day, not the explosive kind of anger, but the quiet, bone-deep kind that comes from fighting battles you never asked for. A foreman had questioned his work, suggested he take shortcuts, implied he wasn't qualified for the job he'd been doing flawlessly for a decade. Her father had knelt down after dinner, taking her small hands in his calloused ones. "Baby girl, the world won't always be kind to you. People will try to make you small because of how you look, or where you're from, or who you love. They'll have 1,000 reasons why you don't belong in the spaces you've earned the right to occupy." Kendra remembered how his voice had dropped lower, more urgent. "But you have a voice, and sometimes the bravest thing you can do is use it, not because speaking up guarantees you'll win. Not because it's easy or safe or comfortable, but because silence in the face of wrong is its own kind of betrayal. You understand me?" She'd nodded, not fully understanding then what she understood now, that her father had been preparing her for Flight 827 long before she'd ever boarded it, that every lesson about standing tall, speaking up, demanding dignity, had been leading to that moment at 30,000 feet, when she'd had to choose between safety and justice. Her bedroom door opened quietly. Rochelle came in and sat beside her daughter at the window, following her gaze to the blinking planes overhead. For a while, they sat in comfortable silence, the kind only possible between people who could communicate without words. Finally, Kendra signed, her movements slow and thoughtful. "I've been thinking about that day, about whether I was actually brave or just tired of being afraid." Rochelle turned to face her daughter fully, her expression serious. She signed with the deliberate precision she used when saying something important. "Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing to act despite it. You were terrified on that plane. I saw it, but you stood up anyway. That's what bravery looks like. It's not fearlessness. It's deciding that some things matter more than your fear." "But it's exhausting," Kendra signed back. "Being young and black and constantly having to prove I deserve basic respect. You face it too. The world treating your deafness like it's a problem instead of just a difference. Don't you get tired of fighting?" "Every single day," Rochelle signed, her honesty stark and raw. "But here's what I've learned. Injustice thrives in silence. Discrimination depends on good people looking away. Cruelty persists because witnesses tell themselves it's not their problem. But when one person refuses to be silent, when one person stands up, they give others permission to do the same. That's what you did. That's what Patricia's letter proved." Kendra thought about this, about how her voice had traveled beyond that airplane, beyond that moment, into workplaces and schools and homes she'd never see, about how courage might actually be contagious, spreading from person to person like light passing from one candle to another. "What if I'd stayed quiet?" she signed. "What if I'd just let it happen?" "But you didn't," her mother signed firmly. "That's what matters. You saw wrong and you refused to accept it as normal. You used your voice when adults wouldn't. And because you did, things changed. Not everything, not permanently, but enough." Rochelle pulled her daughter close, and they watched the planes together, thinking about all the Kendras and Bridgets and Patricias moving through the sky. Thinking about how change doesn't happen in grand sweeping moments, but in small acts of courage that ripple outward in ways you can't predict or control. Years later, Kendra would go on to win more spelling bees. She'd graduate at the top of her class. She'd become a civil rights attorney, fighting the same battles her father and mother had fought, armed with the lesson she'd learned at 13, that your voice matters, that dignity is non-negotiable, that sometimes the hardest thing and the right thing are the same thing. She never forgot Flight 827, neither did anyone else who was there that day. Mr. Okafor referenced it in speeches about judicial courage. Mrs. Patel told a story to her daughter as she grew up, teaching her that speaking up was always worth it. Patricia Chen became an advocate at her workplace, the woman people went to when they witnessed discrimination because they knew she wouldn't look away. And Bridget Calloway? She faded into obscurity, her name occasionally surfacing in diversity training seminars as a cautionary tale about what happens when prejudice masquerades as professionalism. Because sometimes a final warning is really a first step toward justice. Injustice will appear in your life, in grocery stores, at schools, on airplanes, in spaces you thought were safe. The question isn't whether you'll witness it. The question is, when you do, what will you do about it? Will you be a Patricia who stays silent, or will you be a Kendra who stands up? Will you look away, or will you speak? Will you make yourself smaller, or will you demand that others rise to meet you? The choice is yours. It's always been yours. And every single day, that choice matters.